Okay, good morning everybody. Ladies and gentlemen here in Pretoria and joining us via live stream online. Thanks very much for joining us for this morning's seminar on the latest public safety policy and the secret behind its success, the White Paper for Safety and Security. I'm Andrew Fall. I'm a consultant with the Justice and Violence Prevention Program here in Pretoria, but I'm based in Cape Town. And before telling you a bit about this seminar and the series that it's part of, I just want to acknowledge the Untitled Foundation, who have generously made this and other seminars possible for us, as well as the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the USA, and the European Union. As I said, we're hosting this seminar as part of a series that looks at the use of data and evidence and mapping to inform crime and violence prevention. In September, we hosted a seminar in Cape Town where two members of the Bavarian State Police, facilitated by the Hans-Seidel Foundation, gave insight into their use of analytics and crime mapping in the planning of their operational work, and the South African Police Service joined them there to give us some insight into their station intelligence profiles, the way that they map and analyze and deploy using data. Then last week in Cape Town, we had a civil society complement to that seminar. So we had a police data seminar, we had a civil society seminar last week looking at the use of GIS data from an external perspective, what we can tell and can't tell using data available to us from the SAPs, and looking at alternative methodologies for mapping crime in the form of community mapping, focus groups and the like, which the Western Cape Department of Community Safety has done some very interesting work with. We also looked at the correlation between police resources and murder and what we can tell from that. Today, as I said, we're going to be taking this forward, but locating the conversation in the context of the White Paper for Safety and Security. The White Paper was drafted by the Civilian Secretariat for Police Service in 2016, but launched at a national crime summit, sorry, not launched, but given renewed attention a few weeks ago at a national crime summit in Pretoria, attended by various stakeholders from across the country. For those of you who aren't familiar, the White Paper takes a very holistic approach to crime and safety, crime prevention and safety generation in South Africa. So it's not criminal justice focused. It's acknowledging that there are a range of risk and protective factors that we need to keep in account, from positive parenting and nutrition in the first 1,000 days of life to obviously police deployment and analytics. And within this framework, the White Paper calls for a center that draws on data from across society, looking at as many indicators as possible to keep track of the holistic health of society, and to use that data to guide interventions, to inform interventions, to review the efficacy of interventions. So today we're going to hear a little bit about the White Paper from Tumi Moahi, from Deputy Director in Research and Policy at the Civilian Secretariat. She's going to introduce the paper, show us a brief video to familiarize us with its vision. We're then going to hear from two experts who work with data in analyzing crime, harm and safety, and in considering the efficacy of interventions. We'll hear from Anine Kriegler, who's joining us from the University of Cape Town, the Centre of Criminology there. Anine is a crime analyst and co-author of the book, A Citizen's Guide to Crime Trends in South Africa, which is an excellent read for any of you who haven't read it yet. She'll be presenting some very interesting analysis on murder at quite a local level in South Africa, based on the limited data we have. We'll then hear from Dr. Ian Edelstein, who's a postdoctoral fellow and research specialist at the Human Science Research Council. Ian has some very interesting GIS point data for violent crime in Khayelitsha in Cape Town, Khayelitsha being one of Cape Town's more violent areas. And he will take us through what we can and can't tell from that data, the potential that it holds, the limits that it poses in its current form. And then he'll also talk about the challenge of evaluating crime and violence prevention interventions, that being central to the White Paper. Implementing interventions, monitoring them, considering what works, and then scaling things up. So that's where we are today. I'm going to hand over to Tumi to introduce us to the White Paper.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see me. I am a bit vertically challenged, as you can see. Thank you very much for attending the session, and thank you, ISS and Untitled, for this opportunity as well. Before I start my presentation, I'm going to play a short video that basically highlights what the strategic thrust of the White Paper on Safety and Security is, and provides a lot of the contextual background in terms of what the policy intent is in terms of the White Paper on Safety. Technology. Okay.
Safety should be measured by the extent to which the most vulnerable in society feel and are safe from crime and violence and the conditions that breed it. More than 2 decades into democracy, many South African communities continue to experience high rates of crime and violence, affecting the well-being of our society and limiting the development potential of our country. Addressing violence and crime effectively is not possible for the police or any single actor alone. It requires moving away from relying on reactive law enforcement approaches alone towards pursuing a collaborative, integrated approach that focuses on prevention. An integrated approach is a cornerstone of the new White Paper on Safety and Security adopted by the South African Cabinet in April 2016. Achieving safer communities requires a whole of government and a whole of society approach, meaning that national, provincial, and local government interventions need to be effectively coordinated and aligned and need to collaborate with communities, civil society, academia, and business. The White Paper reaffirms that building safe and resilient communities is a collective responsibility. Local government plays a critical role in building safe communities, and this means that municipalities must take the lead in developing tailored local solutions for safety challenges. People in communities should be involved in identifying safety challenges. An active citizenry is important for developing appropriate responses from the ground up, with a particular focus on the inclusion of marginalized communities. It also requires community platforms to play a key role as local platforms for vibrant discussions and engagement on solving local safety challenges. These platforms ensure that community safety strategies are jointly planned and implemented. For example, by including them into integrated development plans. The White Paper foresees the establishment of a National Safety, Crime and Violence Prevention Centre and similar directorates at provincial level to support, monitor, and evaluate prevention measures across government. The aim is to ensure that policy priorities are aligned and departments are held accountable for making their respective contributions. The success of violence prevention efforts depends on a solid knowledge and evidence base to be able to understand safety challenges and develop solutions that work. This means that credible data needs to be made available and be effectively utilized. Local government must therefore generate information necessary for this purpose. The National Centre and provincial directorates will facilitate the collection and sharing of knowledge. Building safer and resilient communities requires coordination and collaboration. We need to accept collective responsibility for building a safer South Africa. Together, we can achieve more.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. So I mentioned that the video kind of goes into detail in terms of the contextual background, so I'm not going to repeat what has already been said. Suffice to say that the 2016 White Paper on Safety and Security emanates from a review of the 1998 White Paper, which the review process culminated into the development of two distinct policy frameworks. One being a policy framework that focuses mainly on the core elements of policing and the policing environment, and the second being a focus on the integrated and developmental approach to safety, crime, and violence prevention. Sorry, technology. Okay. Yeah, the primary objective of the policy is to provide an overarching framework on safety, crime, and violence prevention in order to facilitate synergy and alignment, as has already been mentioned, of other government policies on safety and security. So the focus of the white paper, I think, can be summarized in one word: prevention, prevention, prevention. In terms of the approach, since the white paper has, since the video has already highlighted key elements of the approach of the white paper, I will only highlight three key issues. The first being, my apologies. The first being the approach in terms of a developmental life cycle approach, which talks to addressing risk factors by intervening in different stages of a person's life in order to build resilience to crime. The second, my apologies. Sorry, my apologies. I'm seeing something different on the screen. So the second approach advocated by the white paper is the whole of society approach, as mentioned in the video, which is essentially about creating a coordinated network of people who can solve a common problem in a coordinated manner through intersectoral and intergovernmental consultation, collaboration, and coordination. So essentially what the whole of society approach says is so essentially what the whole of society approach advocates is in terms of how to address the root causes, who should be involved in solving this common problem, and how can we align resources to these proposed solutions. And of particular relevance to today's discussions is the evidence-based approach, which implies that any interventions and programs to address crime and violence must be based on the tried and tested, and must be informed by a multidisciplinary foundation of knowledge about crime problems, their multiple causes, and other promising and proven practices. So an evidence-based approach through the use of data helps us. So an evidence-based approach through the use of data helps us to ensure that our policy choices can be implemented as it provides strategic information in terms of what is happening on the ground. So the availability and collection of reliable data to informed responsive interventions is an essential component of the crime and violence prevention approach that is advocated in the white paper. So for those of you who may have been able to participate in our National Consultative Summit on Crime and Violence Prevention in September, you would be aware that we have a draft implementation framework for the white paper that we're currently consulting on, which is guided by the policy objectives in the white paper, which seek to create a mechanism for coordinating, monitoring, evaluating, and reporting on the implementation of crime prevention priorities across all sectors. So the framework seeks to give effect to the policy intent of the white paper by setting out the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders, some of the thematic interventions that can contribute to promoting safety, and the system-level requirements that need to be put in place to create an enabling environment for effective implementation. So the framework allocates specific roles and responsibilities to the different spheres of government in terms of national, provincial, and local. I won't go into detail in terms of that because the video has already kind of given an overview. So the white paper also categorizes the thematic areas of intervention into 6 key themes, which are an integrated criminal justice system, early intervention, victim support, effective and integrated service delivery, safety through environmental design, and active public and community participation. So Andrew has already given kind of an overview in terms of what the activities within those themes can be to collectively address crime and violence prevention. The draft framework also goes into detail in terms of what are some of the system level requirements that need to be put in place to facilitate effective implementation of the white paper. Some of these include the establishment of implementation structures and institutional mechanisms, the allocation of resources and budgets to safety planning, the alignment of policies and programs, public and community participation, institutionalizing intergovernmental coordination and cooperation, and last but not least, evidence-based planning and implementation. So of significant importance to today's discussions is the establishment of a National Center for Community Safety, Crime and Violence Prevention. The aim of establishing this center is to promote large-scale use and sustainability of evidence-based crime and violence prevention programming in South Africa in order to influence strategy, provide technical support, develop a knowledge base through research and evaluation of crime and violence prevention programs, mobilizing and channeling resources effectively, and capacitating the various role players in terms of implementing crime and violence prevention programs. So the strategic intent in terms of the establishment of the center is basically to create a central or a strategic focal point in terms of technical support and driving strategy in relating to the implementation of the white paper. The proposed objectives of the center include the following: the provision of expertise, mobilizing resources, as I've mentioned, facilitating shared learning and development of partnerships, monitoring implementation and conducting evaluations, collating and analyzing data, and providing a repository of knowledge and information. So this center is envisaged to be basically the knowledge or data hub for the implementation of the white paper. The implementation framework then proposes that a business model should be developed by the department that will be responsible for planning, monitoring, and evaluation, with input from the various role players and sector experts, setting out in detail in terms of how the center should operate effectively. So implementing the white paper should be supported by a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation framework that should be institutionalized into existing M&E frameworks and reporting systems in government. And the white paper proposes that it be integrated into existing performance management systems, performance agreements, and strategic plans in order to ensure accountability and effective oversight. Some of the core components of an effective M&E framework should include overarching government outcomes and indicators for community safety, system-level outcomes and indicators, thematic outcomes and indicators, and a set of M&E tools to facilitate implementation and reporting. So lastly, what is our role as practitioners? I think today is a good step, in the right direction, because through such platforms we are able to establish relationships and networks with each other as practitioners, to identify critical policy areas and areas for collaboration, to be able to facilitate a multidisciplinary and evidence-based approach as required by the white paper. So I'm looking forward to hearing what our other two experts have to say in terms of what approaches or interventions are out there in terms of data and the use of data. Understanding the socioeconomic context and safety landscape, presenting alternative ways of doing things, providing a basis for innovation, mainstreaming research and information for the collective benefit, and lastly, increasing the overall body of knowledge in the field of safety, crime, and violence prevention. So I will end off with a cliched style conclusion to my presentation with a quote that says, "For policy to have an impact, there has to be an organizational and professional culture that is receptive to the idea that knowledge has a critical part to play in the determination of policy." Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tumi. So for anybody who wasn't aware of the white paper, as you can see, it's hugely ambitious, it's broad in its vision, it's very optimistic, and it's easy to be seduced by. I think it's difficult at face value to say, why shouldn't we pursue this, why shouldn't we implement it? The challenge, of course, is implementation. We have the vision, now we need the leadership, we need the will, we need the systems and the mechanisms. Tumi talked about creating the framework for implementation, creating the systems. So there's clearly lots of work to be done, and hopefully conversations like this will assist that. We're now going to hear from Anine Kriegler from the University of Cape Town, who'll talk about one of the things that could happen in this data analysis center, looking at murder data.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today and to be part of this conversation. Oh, sorry. Is that better? Okay. Great. So I'm going to be talking about confirming quite a few things that have already been said, but maybe getting into slightly more specifics, but not too much, and talking about data and evidence-based policing. So what is evidence-based policing? Essentially, it comes down to figuring out what works, and that seems like a very simple concept, but in practice it gets a little bit tricky. And what it really is based on is a shift in modern policing over about the last 50 years. And that shift has been described as from what are called the 3 Rs of random patrol, rapid response, and reactive investigations, which is still how a lot of policing is done in most of the world, perhaps, to increasingly the 3 Ts of targeting, testing, and tracking. And those are difficult things to do, and this movement has happened for a couple of reasons. One is just increasing data capacity, data technologies and mapping that has made things a lot easier. Another aspect of that is tight resources in a lot of contexts have made it necessary to target things, target interventions much better than we have in the past. And we have the experience of at least 50 years of increasing learning about how to do this. And part of that is particularly in the UK, which has seen a lot of professionalization of their policing, but there and otherwise in other places, also through partnerships between the police and other data professionals. And the outcome of all of this is that modern policing is much more reliant on data than ever before, and increasingly so. Instead of seeing data as just an output of policing, it has to be an input and an output, and in the whole cycle of how we plan and do our policing. And that's a whole lot of different kinds of data that requires, and one of the big pieces of data it requires is about crime prevalence, just how much crime is happening when and where. That is a core challenge, and it's a lot trickier than you might think it is. One reason that it's tricky is because, for the most part, this data is used as a performance measurement tool for the police and as a political football. And it's almost always in a negative way. No one is ever praised when crime rates supposedly go down, but everyone is punished when crime rates seem to go up. And that's a problem. And there are also some inherent problems with crime prevalence data and some technical challenges, and that's a bit more what I'm going to be talking about today. So thinking about how we move towards building the right evidence base to be able to do evidence-based policing and figure out what works. So I think an important aspect of that is to focus on murder stats for reasons that I will enlarge on shortly. Another important thing is, in some contexts at least, we need to be working with rates per capita. If you're tracking over time, you need rates per capita, and if you're tracking between areas of different sizes, we need rates per capita. And that's a problem, therefore, that we need appropriate population estimates on an ongoing basis. I think also it's important that we don't forget the long term. Short-term shifts and changes are invaluable, but the long term is something that we have lost sight of, I think, in a lot of our planning and thinking. And I think that we need to think about our level of geographic aggregation and try to be quite inclusive in that, because I think there are lessons from all the different levels. But we need to certainly go to a very small level. We know that crime is highly concentrated within a neighborhood, even within a street segment, within a block segment. And although some people get access to that data on an ongoing basis, that isn't easy to access, and it needs to be much more easily accessible. We also need to know other things about the crime incidents that are happening. There's a huge difference between a fairly opportunistic robbery of someone robbing people of their pay packet when they come home on a Friday afternoon, and a highly organized carjacking or a cash in transit. So we need these details about weapons used, time of day, victim and suspected perpetrator characteristics. These are absolutely important things that we need, again, on the smallest geographic aggregation possible. How do we get that? So partly from docket analyses, so existing police data, also victim surveys, ideally as well on national, local, and very hyper-local levels, and through participatory mapping with communities. And this is something that I try to work on quite a bit, that I think is something we need to keep in mind. Is part of this process is going to involve building popular understanding about what the stats are, what they can do, what they do tell us, and what they can never tell us. Because I think there are a lot of myths about crime stats in a lot of places, and also to be realistic about what policing is and what policing can do, and to inform the public about that so that we can have better conversations. And I think this is the key thing that I'm going to come back to at the end, but if there's only one thing that you take from my presentation, I hope it's this. I think core to this is that we need to rethink how we conceive of crime statistics. And really move towards thinking of them as a public tool for collective problem solving. It's not about punishing individual police stations or officers or commissioners or whatever political game gets being played, but this is a public resource that needs to be accessible for us all to be able to use in different ways, in our different spheres, to solve problems together. And that's going to take, it's a long-term goal, and it's going to take a lot of reorganization on a geographical level, potentially, I would hope, but certainly on an institutional level from the policing side, and just how we organize the data. We need to think about how to make this data a public, usable resource. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through a couple of examples, really, of what I've been talking about. And so I'm going to show you here a graph, and I'm going to ask you to guess the country. This graph is recorded rates of residential burglary per 100,000. This data is about 2 years old now, actually. It's from the UNODC. So this is accounting for population size. What is the rate of residential burglary? So that's non-violent, not a robbery, a burglary in a number of countries. Okay, so those are the options. Those are the 6 different countries. And what they are Denmark, New Zealand, the UK, the USA, Brazil, and South Africa. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to think which one is which. And I'm pretty sure you're going to be wrong, because Denmark is that one. New Zealand is that one. The UK is that one. The US, Brazil, and South Africa. So what's the point of this? Residential burglary stats are very interesting, but they are so subject to different norms, different policing norms, different legal systems, and crucially, the relationship between communities and the police. In New Zealand, a larger proportion of burglaries get reported to the police because people have an expectation of personal safety and an expectation that the police are going to help them out. Whereas in Brazil, that is much less the case. So the problem is that's not an accurate reflection of the crime that's happening in those countries whatsoever. We can't use these stats for those purposes. Looking within South Africa now, this is from our National Victims of Crime Survey. This is the 2016-17 data. And what they ask people is, if you've been a victim of residential burglary in the last year, did you report it to the police? And we can split that up by population group. And what we see is, again, very large variation, with white people in South Africa about twice as likely to report a residential burglary as black. And there's many reasons for that we can get into, but the upshot of it is, if we are comparing a predominantly white area with a predominantly black area, we're seeing a much larger proportion of the burglaries that are happening in a white area making it into the official statistics as compared to in a predominantly black area. So that means we can't compare Rondebosch and Khayelitsha on the basis of these stats either. So that's why we use murder rates. That's the advantage of murder rates and why I think that we should put a lot of focus on them. So firstly, there's a legal requirement to report murder. There isn't a legal requirement to report most other crimes. It's relatively easily and consistently defined internationally and over time and in lay understanding. Not always, as we saw in the Oscar Pistorius case. There can still be disagreement about what is and isn't murder, even as it goes through the courts. It's very difficult to hide, deny, or downplay, and that's on the part of victims and communities, but particularly on the part of police as well. It's hard to classify a murder as something else, perhaps as a culpable homicide. But a great thing about murder rates is, unlike with other crimes, we've got existing other data sources to help us with, because in the case of murder, there's some distinctive object, unfortunately, that is left over that we can count in an independent way from the police. And the key way with that is mortuary statistics. And there's generally a pretty good match between police murder stats and mortuary stats. It's not perfect, but in terms of trend and distribution, it's pretty good. And so for this reason, in a lot of research, we just use murder rates as representative or as a proxy for crime and violence more generally. And that's the reason why it's the gold standard for measurement and comparison over time and between different places. So I'm going to show you just a few examples of what you can do with murder rates, what murder rates can teach you on different levels of aggregation and different ways of slicing it. And I just want to apologize, my presentation got squished a little bit, so the numbers aren't going to look as good as they did when I planned them. But okay, on the one end of the spectrum, on the safe end of the spectrum, I hope you can read it on this board, we have Germany, New Zealand, the UK, Australia, Canada, and the USA, with rates per 100,000 of less than 1 per 100,000, and in the US, which is considered very high by developed world standards, of almost 5 per 100,000. So that's at the safe end of the spectrum. Then we've got a really big gap, leaving out most of the countries in the middle, and now I'm going to show you what the opposite end of the spectrum, the countries with the very highest rates of murder per capita, look like. So there we see a couple of interesting things about this. Firstly, what I think is interesting about it is the extent of the variation. To me, that's a very hopeful sign that human nature is highly malleable by circumstances. The fact that we can see a range of over 100-fold in murder rates in different conditions suggests that conditions matter, I think. I think another interesting thing about it is there are only a handful of what I've called the 30s club, and South Africa is one of them. There's really, less than 10 countries in the world that have murder rates about as high as ours. So South Africa is a very high murder rate country. Then who do we see on this side of the spectrum? We see countries that are new, modernizing democracies. It's not the poorest countries in the world. It's places that have recent histories of major social and political upheaval and especially violence. Of course, South Africa is a key example of that. And it's places that have high levels of inequality and concentrations of poverty and deprivation. So again, it gives us an understanding of why South Africa finds itself in this part of the spectrum. So another way we can look at it is over time. So this is some research I've done, collecting the South African murder rate over a century and tracking that. And what we see is a line that looks like that. We can talk about a lot about the methodological details there, but I'm going to skim over it for time purposes. But I think some interesting things that this graph tells us are, firstly, that we've been at least this high a level of crime since for at least 50 years. So to blame high crime levels in South Africa on the Guptas, for example, is not going to take us very far, I think, because we've been where we are, or worse, for at least 50 years. Then we see this big increase, and so the point to me is we joined this 30s club, which we haven't left since, in the 50s and 60s. That's where the core damage was done to South Africa that we haven't recovered from, and that I think speaks to forced removals primarily. Then we see this big increase in the 80s and early 90s, which I think is fairly well understood. We see the decrease from 94 to 2011, and an increase from 2011 onwards. I'm particularly interested in that decrease because I think it's something we haven't discussed enough. So that's a lot of the focus of my work. But of course, South Africa is a big place and extremely diverse and extremely unequal. It's over 1 million square kilometers, and there's at least 22,000 what we can call neighborhoods or sub-places under the last census. And each one of those is extremely different. What is happening in Rondebosch and Khayelitsha are very, very different pictures. Again, I won't go into detail here. I hope that the next speaker will do much better at this. But just to point out for the people that have tried to work with mapping crime, it's difficult in South Africa because of boundaries. In short, the boundaries make matching useful data with the police data extremely difficult, and it's a technical project. So ordinary people aren't able actually to make sense of the crime stats unless they can use a GIS program or need have a lot of support in interpreting those stats. So I want to just focus in a little bit and look at, okay, yes, I will, 5 minutes, and look at the provinces. And if we look at the trend from 1994 to 2018 in our provinces, in murder rates per capita, per 100,000 that is, we see a graph that looks like that. So again, there's a lot of interesting things that we might pull out of that. I think one important thing is that every single province has a lower murder rate now than it did in 1994. Some have done much better than others. You see that light blue line, KZN, and the dark blue line, Gauteng. They have seen massive, massive reductions in their murder rates over the last 20 years. The Western Cape is an outlier in this whole process. It's the only one that saw an increase and some stability in that first period, and it's seen by far the most rapid increase over the last 8 years. Zooming in a little bit more, if we look on a municipal level, around 1996, that's what the map looks like of South Africa. I hope you can see the color differences there. And that's, oh, that got a bit funny, but that's Lesotho, just in case you're not familiar with the map. That's not just a place that has no crime. And if we look at the scale like this, we can learn some things. For example, of the about 234 municipalities, about 91 of them were in that 0 to 50 per 100,000 range, 61 in that, 48 in that, and at least 34 municipalities had murder rates over 100 per 100,000, which is extremely, extremely high. That means 1 in every 1,000 people in that municipality being murdered every year. There are very few cities in the world that have rates that high, and they are infamously dangerous, and we can see where those places are. And if we keep that same scale for 2011, it looks like that, which I think is quite interesting, because what we have is 0 municipalities with a rate of over 100 per 100,000, 0 in the next band as well, 21 in the next band, and by far the majority in what would have been the 2 safest bands in 1996. So I think that's something that we forget, that there's a lot of good news there. 2 more minutes. If we look at the bigger cities over more recent years, in murder rates again, there's some insight here. Again, I think what's particularly interesting here is the city of Cape Town, just absolutely quite unlike any of the other cities. But quite a few of the cities have actually seen a murder rate increase since 2011, Pretoria being one of the very lucky few that hasn't. If we then look inside Cape Town, because Cape Town is a big place and it is itself very varied, massive variation in murder rates between different precincts, from places that have 0 to places like Philippi East, where it's probably in the region of 350 per 100,000 at 2011 population, which is a problem, but we can come back to that. But even within Philippi East, we did a survey of 251 people about 2 years ago, and asked people, how dangerous is this area compared to other places where you regularly spend time? And we found significant variation from the general norm in Philippi East to a part of Philippi East known as Lower Crossroads, which people considered to be much more dangerous. Okay, so in conclusion, as the white paper puts forth, and is certainly best practice, I believe, now in thinking internationally, is highly targeted problem-solving approaches to policing. So The idea is that we use murder rates as a proxy or as a lever to get at other crimes. It's not that we don't care about other crimes, it's just that murder is easier to measure. Easy to measure and define, hard to manipulate. We need to focus on the very highest murder rate stations where there's a lot of room to reduce. But that's not small enough. We need to focus in much smaller than the station level to really get at what's going on there, at identifying the hotspots and understanding those hotspots, because we need to understand the mechanisms that we're trying to engage with. So that's going to involve partnering between the police and Stat South Africa, academics, NGOs, and communities in a very systematic way. Again, targeted interventions, not dispersed. And there's a strong cost effectiveness case to be made here, but just a general effectiveness case as well. Explicitly focused on not just prevention, I would say, but problem solving. That's a key part of, I think, how we need to do this. So that involves, we need to set out clear roles and coordination between different actors. This is not entirely or even primarily a policing problem generally. It is a whole of society problem that needs to be solved in a whole of society way. And again, just to come back to this point, we need to shift our thinking about crime stats and come to a collective understanding that they are limited in ways that we're going to learn more about now, but they are a shared resource and they are an essential tool not just for the police to monitor themselves and to plan their operations, but for everyone as part of this collective whole of society approach to be able to use them to solve problems. So thank you very much. If you don't have time to ask any questions in this session, please feel free to email me for further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anine. So a perfect illustration of why this focus on data in the white paper is so important. Crime isn't evenly dispersed. Crime is very localized. We need to understand generators of crime as problems that need to be addressed. In order to understand and address problems, we need data, which takes us back to the idea of this ambitious hub and the important idea that data should be democratized. If we're all going to be partners in creating a safer country, we should be able to have access to the data to help keep ourselves safe and work together to solve problems. We're now going to be hearing from Dr. Ian Elstein from the HSRC, who will be talking about the particulars of SAP's GIS data in relation to contact crime and what it can and can't tell us. Thanks very much, Ian.
Okay, good afternoon, nearly afternoon, everyone. I promise I'm not going to be a wet blanket. But there are some caveats that go with this presentation, as you will soon see. First of all, I was assisted by my colleague Robert Arnott, who couldn't be with us today. He helped a lot with the spatial analysis and with the Excel crunching. So I will talk about, basically we'll try and work our way from a global level. This is for Khayelitsha, as you'll soon see, down to a hotspot level, looking along the way at trends, temporal aspects, hotspot spatial aspects, oddities and anomalies, which are numerous, how to potentially go about looking into hotspots, how to analyze a site-based intervention, and a conclusion such as it is. So, two caveats. One, I'm a sociologist, not a criminologist, so I certainly agree with the previous speakers that we need to be thinking in preventative terms, and that the causes of violence and the relationship between violence and inequality cannot be denied, but we have to be thinking from a much more developmental approach and not simply about policing vis-a-vis data. So that's the one. The other, as you'll soon see, the data have anomalies. So we know there are issues with the data at point level. It has been very hard to access, and as you'll see, there are issues with it, and that limits all that we can analyze coming out of it. So what we're looking at is Greater Khayelitsha. So this is comprised of Khayelitsha Police Station, Lingaleti West, and Harare Police Station. So you see In the green up top, that's Khayelitsha, the red is Linguletu West, and Harare in the blue, and some anomalies already appearing in terms of where some of these crimes are located and where there are pockets where there are no crimes. Does a pointer work? No, it doesn't. Okay. Is there a way to bring up a pointer? Yeah, well, or a cursor. Okay. Anyways, we'll carry on. So, still at this global level, so I've combined all of Greater Khayelitsha, and in terms of murder rate per capita, I've estimated that it's approximately 90 per 100,000 persons. So it's approaching that very high 100,000, 100 per 100,000 threshold that we've seen from some of the most violent countries and most violent cities in the world. So in terms of total murders on the left, we see somewhat of a decline from, and then we're just looking, sorry, at 10 years of data. So from April 1st, 2006 through 31st of March, 2016. So I referred to those years as from 2007 to 2016. So we see a drop both in murders and in total combined robberies. I've chosen just to look at those. Murders being, as the previous speaker mentioned, a statistic that obviously represents one of the most serious crimes, but also potentially one that is less subject to manipulation, missing data, etc. And these 5 categories of robberies being a statistic, robberies that could be affected by different policing, could be policeable crimes. So we see a drop from 2007 into 2009, 10, 11 on both sides that then starts going back up again with potentially some change in the very last year. And I think that we've heard anecdotally from previous ISS speakers, researchers, that even the previous speaker, performance management incentives may have had something to do with some of the lower reportings of data in that 2009, 10, 11 period. And I'll leave it at that. So looking at it by police station and year, it's a little bit hard to read. They're stacked, so obviously the bigger lines represent all the combined robberies, and we do see quite a precipitous increase for Harare and Khayelitsha police station, somewhat less for Linguletu West, that's in the light blue. But murders seem to be staying relatively stable, so to speak. I mean, that graph is obviously somewhat attenuated according to the number of robberies, but quite a bit of change, seemingly, in the number of robberies, less change in the number of murders. Unpacking that, we were curious if there are different effects between the winter and summer months. So winter months would be June, July, and August. Summer months, December, January, February. And interesting that we see peaks for especially the robbery crimes around 5 o'clock in the morning in the summer. That seems to shift to about 6 o'clock in the morning in the winter. And a very precipitous peak, 8 o'clock in the evening in the summer. Seems to start a little bit earlier in the winter from 7 o'clock in the evening and carry on through 8 o'clock. But after that, it starts going down quite a lot. So some questions to be asked: is that really when crimes are escalating, or is this some kind of artifact about when crimes are actually being reported or recorded? Unpacking that further, looking at crimes by hour of the day. So you see some rather different trends, some of those same kind of peaks, especially with common robbery, robbery with a firearm, with the morning and the evening peaks. Something different certainly in terms of murder, where it does seem to be climbing throughout the day. If we think of when people are getting up, 5 a.m. towards the evening time, and business robbery as well, climbing throughout the day. But yeah, we still see this tendency for many of the crimes, the robberies, to be reported at this 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock hours. Looking at days of the week, Nothing too surprising there. We see a kind of an increase from Wednesday through towards the end of the week. Friday, Saturdays being the largest, followed by Sunday, and even into Monday. And that's just for robberies. This is by day of the month. And what I think is interesting here, and I don't want to skip anything else, but to me there's no real clear trend, except obviously there's a drop on the right side because not all months have 31 days. But if you look at the first of the month, there seems to be quite a high level, particularly for murder in red, also for common robbery on the first day of the month. So I found that a little bit surprising, especially with murders. Why would it be so high on that day alone? And just unpacking that to see it on its own, and this is with the actual numbers. So this is again over the 10-year period for all of Khayelitsha, 212 murders occurring on the first day of the month over a 10-year period. The very next being what it looks like the third, 141 murders. So either there's something happening in Khayelitsha on the first of the month, or again, this could be an artifact of how even murders are recorded in terms of date, also potentially in terms of time, as I mentioned. I do have a few other slides trying to unpack that further at the end if time permits, but now I want to start to get into trying to do some of the hotspot analysis. So this is looking at all robberies. I'm leaving out murders because the murder numbers are so few in comparison with the robberies. So these are 267 meter square grids. The idea being a 3x3 grid then becomes an 800 meter square, roughly a square, several square kilometers, sorry. So this is looking at the total number of all those 5 combined robbery categories, and we do see clearly some hotspots with numbers. I think the highest is, yeah, I think the resolution is going to be too low, but the brightest red, you're talking about several hundred happening in that 267 meter grid in terms of robberies. So this is one way to start to lay things out. We did experiment working with the small area levels that the previous speaker had shown. Part of the issue there is both the assumption about the population within the small area levels and whether or not there's more that can be understood. So we tried to work with uniform grids instead. Okay, and here is for all murders. So we do see some hot spots and many cool spots within Khayelitsha itself. This is now using a different technique to try and create sort of bands. If one were to stretch a rubber band 200 meters around a grouping of crimes with a certain particular threshold. So I think this is with a threshold of 30 crimes, and this here I've noted where the police stations are located, and you see immediately adjacent, right above and right below the Khayelitsha police station seem to be the hottest spots. So we'll unpack this further. I think the crimes happening below, there's a big shopping center. I think that is realistic. The crimes happening above or adjacent, maybe something else going on. So this is with I think the smallest threshold, 30 crimes per group. And again, I apologize that these numbers are fairly difficult to view. If we increase the threshold, then we see fewer hotspots, but still the most prominent remains around both the Khayelitsha police station, even the Lingala 2 West being one of them as well. And then this is with one of the tighter thresholds, and I think this was for 200 crimes. So if we think about 200 crimes over 10 years, then it does become possible to identify more select hotspots. Often these appear to be major intersections where potentially the crimes are being geolocated for lack of potentially more accurate references. And just looking at 2015, since this was the highest crime period after that uptick from 2011, again, these are the 200-meter ranges with at least 30 points. Just for that year alone, we've got a sense that there are fewer hotspots still something going on around the Khayelitsha police station. And this would obviously have been since the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry, when potentially there was more attention being paid on policing work and ideally on the collection and analysis of data. Viewed differently, this would be just using 200-meter radius hotspots, again, 30 points per hotspot. So this gives us a finer analysis, and we'll go into that further. But first I want to talk about some of the issues with the data. So these are what I've called grid-patterned data. And I think you can probably see that they don't look right. They're being laid out in a grid or grids, and one of them is basically across the road from the Khayelitsha police station. Zooming in a little bit more, here you can see that in the top, the grid seems to extend into a green belt. It's through an informal settlement, I believe that's RR informal settlement, and straight into a green belt area. And here's another one. This is within the Lingaletu West police jurisdiction. Again, extending right across, I think that's Spine Road or Muway, into a green belt area in a grid pattern. So we don't know exactly what's happening here. Chances are this is some kind of artifact of how data is being captured and laid out by a computer program, and whatever sort of user inputs are being input there to space the crimes along the same line, same grid lines, so to speak. So we've heard anecdotally that there are certainly issues with how crimes are recorded, whether or not police are able to actually collect with a GPS device in the field, and what they're able to do with that data, and to what extent, even retrospectively, or when crimes are reported at police stations, to try and, as precisely as possible, locate both the time and the location of that particular incident. So with further analysis, we were actually trying to remove these problematic areas so that we could look in more detail. So this is what it looks like when we look over time. This would be for the first half from the 2006 period until the first quarter of 2011. It is color-coded. It becomes a bit confusing to see, but you see this is that informal settlement area. So for the first 5 years, roughly, not a lot going on there. The next 5 years, that's what happens. You can see the grid. You can see, based on the color coding, some house robberies in pink even extend into the green belt area. So clearly, there are problems. Here's a major intersection. First 5 years definitely seems to be a hot spot. A lot going on. Odd that it's happening only on one side of the intersection. The next 5 years, it looks pretty safe. So, maybe one could argue that there were interventions that took place at this particular intersection. In terms of the built environment, I don't think very much has changed over time. Now, we try and look at what we hoped would be a real hotspot. This is the Khayelitsha Mall Shopping Centre, immediately south of the Khayelitsha police station. So you can see the station. We drew this polygon, captured all of the points within it. And you do see some house robberies in pink again within this complex, where there are technically no houses, a concentration down in the corner as well. And here, there's some more stability. So these are the first 5 years. This is still roughly centered on the same complex. I know it's very difficult to read. And the next 5 years, still busy. So when we unpack that, we see some kind of trend with robberies by year starting to increase. Disaggregated between the different robberies, we see business robberies going up, and robbery with a weapon other than a firearm. And there's actually a problem with robbery with a firearm data. I think in one of the stations they're not recording that at all. So taking a bit further, trying to look at trends within this polygon by month, we actually see the winter months seem to be higher in crime. Hours of the day, not surprisingly, that 5 a.m. period, and then here it's 5 in the evening, so maybe that's around the time when businesses are closing, when they're moving cash, etc. Days of the month, no real clear trends. Even days of the week, fewer trends. Some kind of increase from Wednesday to Friday, bigger on Monday. And the last there, by hour and day. So here we're comparing summer and winter by hour of the day. And again, we see clearly that more crime is happening in winter across almost all of the hours, but especially around the evening hours, which I find surprising somehow. So I don't have an explanation for that, but again, I would come back to the question about the data. So this is the last that I'll show. This is really looking at an intervention and the possibility to do a spatial temporal analysis of an intervention. This is centered on the Harare Library and what I would call the safety district. You can see in the middle there's one of these multi-level safety boxes. To the back there are these live workspaces, a courtyard that was designed to try and be more pedestrian friendly, and with the safety box and corridor to increase civilian surveillance of the area. And many millions were spent on this through violence prevention, through urban upgrading. So here we look at a 600-meter radius drawn around the Harare Library. This is just for the combined robberies at this stage. So in the blue, you've got the 600-meter radius. In the red, you've got the data for the rest of Harare Police Station on its own. And then the purple line, I don't know why my percentages aren't reading there. The purple line, you see the percentage of this radius as a share of the total. So the construction work completed around 2009-2010 in this area, and one would have hoped to see, especially given the size, the cost of this intervention, that there could be some kind of effect, especially in the purple line. One would hope that a radiating safety effect, you'd see some kind of drop over that time. And we don't really see that, at least not with the combined robberies. We see it, the share is increasing until 2014. Potentially there's something happening over the previous 2 years, but in terms of sheer numbers, they were highest, they peaked in 2014. And here's just looking at the same area for the first 5 years. There seems to be a concentration at one intersection, not a lot across that precinct that was identified as high crime. Over the next 5 years, we see an even higher concentration at that same intersection. So, my recommendation, conclusion, really is that there is the potential to learn an awful lot from point-level crime data. That's why I've tried to show some ways to analyze, to sift through the data, to look at it temporally, by time of day, day of month, month of the year, by year, to analyze it spatially, to identify hotspots and drill down within those hotspots to try and understand what's going on. But, you know, the old adage with regard to data, garbage in, garbage out, creates huge limitations. And that is not to say that the police are doing a poor job. I think clearly in the context of Khayelitsha, and Khayelitsha is not necessarily unique, they are completely overwhelmed and undercapacitated. So to, I think, bring life to the white paper, to the focus on data, we really need to be cognizant of where we're at in terms of what data is being produced how much we can discern from that data, and how many problems really exist with the data that would need to be corrected through the right tools, the right personnel, the right capacity, the right budgets, the right incentives. And potentially we could then see, through better data, more capacity, and more sharing, a virtuous circle where we are actually able to come back to those preventive interventions and localized interventions that are evidence-based and that are able to show that kind of reduction at a local spatial level. So, thank you. I must leave it there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ian Edelstein from the HSRC. A wake-up call to the romance of the white paper, perhaps. So it's easy to say all we need is the data, it's out there, we just need to build this center, bring in the right brains, and we can crunch the numbers. But perhaps the data isn't being generated. One would think that the SAPs are the custodian of one of our most important and sacred and best data sources, notwithstanding the clear limits of reported crime data. But even if we interpret it as a limited data source, clearly it potentially has lots of flaws that aren't apparent at the surface anyway. At this point, we're going to say goodbye to our live stream guests, and then we will open this up for questions and answers. So thanks very much to the live audience. And could I have an indication